March 19, 1945. The Southern Pacific Railroad rumbles through the vast expanse of West Texas, carrying its most unusual cargo yet. Inside, reinforced boxcars, 217 Japanese servicemen sit in silence, exhausted from weeks at sea and days crossing a continent they had been taught to view as the ultimate enemy. They had surrendered at Saipan, expecting execution or, at best, slow starvation in cramped cells. What they could not have imagined was that in less than 12 hours, their entire understanding of the conflict would begin to unravel over something as simple as dinner. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the account of how American abundance and unexpected humanity transformed captured servicemen into witnesses of a truth their leadership had desperately tried to conceal, and how a single evening in a Texas camp would plant seeds of doubt that no propaganda could overcome. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto pressed his face against the small gap in the boxcar's wooden slats, watching the endless prairie roll past. At 31 years old, he had commanded an artillery battery on Saipan until the final collapse in July of the previous year. 8 months as a prisoner had taught him to expect little and trust nothing. The other men in the car barely spoke. Most were enlisted soldiers, a few petty officers from the imperial forces, all united in their shame and uncertainty. Sergeant Kenji Matsuda, sitting in the corner, clutched a small photograph of his family in Hiroshima. He was 26, had been a schoolteacher before the conflict, and carried within him the education system's teachings about American brutality and moral decay. Every propaganda broadcast he had heard, every training session, had emphasized one unshakable truth. Surrender to the Americans meant torture and degradation, yet here he sat, still breathing, still unharmed after months in captivity. The train began to slow as darkness fell. Through the gaps, Yamamoto could see lights, more lights than he had seen since before the conflict began. The installation that would become their new home sprawled across former ranch land 30 miles outside El Paso. Camp Lordsburg, though they did not yet know its name, had been constructed specifically to house prisoners from the Pacific Theater. As the boxcars ground to a halt, American guards began unlocking the doors. What happened next violated every expectation the Japanese servicemen carried. Instead of shouting or rifle butts forcing them into formation, the American soldiers simply gestured for them to exit and form orderly lines. The camp's commanding officer, Colonel James Mitchell, their veteran administrator who had overseen 3 other facilities, stood watching the new arrivals with the practiced eye of someone who had processed thousands of prisoners. At 48, Mitchell understood that security came not from brutality, but from predictability and fair treatment. The processing took 2 hours. Each man was documented, photographed, and assigned a barracks number. Medical personnel, including Dr. Sarah Chen, a Chinese-American physician from San Francisco, conducted brief health examinations. Her presence confused many of the Japanese prisoners who had been told that Americans and Chinese were mortal enemies. Dr. Chen, 29 years old and one of only 6 female physicians working in the camp system, had volunteered specifically to work with Pacific Theater prisoners, believing medical care transcended politics. As the examinations concluded, the prisoners were led to their assigned barracks. These were not the cramped cells or disease-ridden pens they had anticipated. Each building housed 40 men in bunk beds, with actual mattresses, not straw or bare boards. The structures had heating systems, electric lights, and at the end of each row shower facilities with hot and cold running water. Private First Class Robert Torres, a guard from New Mexico who spoke some Japanese, learned from his wife, watched the prisoners' faces as they entered the barracks. Then Torres said something that would be repeated in whispered conversations for weeks afterward. In halting but comprehensible Japanese, he explained that dinner would be served in 1 hour, that they should clean up if they wished, and that the latrine facilities were fully functional. The normalcy of his tone, the absence of contempt or mockery, unsettled the prisoners more than cruelty would have. Yamamoto gathered the senior men in his barracks. Matsuda joined them, along with Corporal Hiroshi Tanaka, a fisherman from Hokkaido who, at 34, was among the oldest prisoners in the group. Petty Officer Ichiro Sato, a career military man at 28, completed their informal leadership circle. They spoke in low voices, trying to make sense of what they were experiencing. Sato voiced what many were thinking. The conditions seemed designed to lower their guard, to make them vulnerable to interrogation or worse. Surely this comfort was temporary, a prelude to harsher treatment. Matsuda, however, had noticed something during processing. The American soldiers showed no particular hatred, no special malice. They processed the Japanese prisoners with the same bureaucratic efficiency they might apply to any administrative task. This casual lack of hostility was, in its way, more disturbing than open antagonism would have been. The dinner call came at 1800 hours. The prisoners were led across the compound to a large mess hall, a building that could accommodate 500 men at once. The American designers of the camp system had learned that communal dining reduced tension and provided structure to prisoner life. What the Japanese servicemen saw as they entered stopped many of them mid-stride. Long tables were set with metal trays divided into sections. At the serving line, American cooks, assisted by Italian and German prisoners who had been at the camp longer, dispensed food from enormous containers. The smell alone was overwhelming. After months of subsisting on minimal rations during the conflict and basic sustenance during initial captivity, the prisoners now faced portions that seemed impossible. Each man received a tray containing roasted chicken, 2 pieces per person. Alongside came mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans cooked with bacon, fresh bread with butter, and a dessert of canned peaches with cream. Coffee, real coffee, was available along with fresh milk. The total caloric value of the meal exceeded 3,000 calories, more than many of the prisoners had consumed in 2 or 3 days during the final months of fighting on Saipan. Yamamoto stood holding his tray, staring at the food. Around him, his men showed similar confusion. This was not starvation rations. This was not punishment. This was, by any measure, better food than many of them had eaten even before the conflict began. Japan's rationing system had grown increasingly severe from 1943 onward. By the time of Saipan's fall, frontline troops were receiving barely 1,500 calories per day, often less. Civilians at home faced even worse shortages. The prisoners sat in groups, still uncertain, still waiting for the revelation that this was somehow a trick. Matsuda picked up his fork, a real metal utensil, not carved wood or bamboo. He cut a piece of chicken and tasted it. The flavor was rich, seasoned with herbs he could not identify. His hands began to shake slightly. Beside him, Tanaka ate mechanically, his eyes fixed on his tray as though afraid the food might vanish. Across the mess hall, Captain Thomas Wright observed the scene. At 35, Wright served as the camp's chief liaison officer, responsible for prisoner morale and communication. He had seen this moment play out dozens of times with new arrivals. The initial disbelief, the tentative first bites, then the slow realization that this was not temporary, not a special occasion but standard daily fare. Wright had fought in the European theater before his assignment to camp administration. He understood that well-fed prisoners caused fewer problems, recovered better from wounds and illness, and proved more cooperative during intelligence debriefings. But beyond pragmatism, the American camp system operated under Geneva Convention guidelines that mandated treatment equivalent to the captor nation's own soldiers. The food served to prisoners at Lordsburg was nearly identical to what American troops received at bases across the southwestern United States. This fact, simple as it was, contained a truth that propaganda had worked desperately to conceal from Japanese forces and civilians. America possessed such overwhelming productive capacity that it could feed its enemies better than their own government fed them. As the meal continued, conversation began to emerge among the prisoners. Sato, the petty officer, raised a question that others had been thinking. If the Americans could provide such food to prisoners, what did their actual forces receive? What did civilians at home eat? The contrast with Japan's situation was impossible to ignore. Back home, rice rations had fallen to levels that left families constantly hungry. Vegetables were scarce. Protein was nearly non-existent for most civilians. Factory workers labored on empty stomachs. Children showed signs of malnutrition. Yamamoto, who had university education before his military service, began calculating in his head. The chicken alone represented protein intake he had not seen in a year. The bread was made from wheat, probably American wheat, from the endless grain fields of the Midwest. The dairy products came from American farms producing more milk than the Japanese islands had ever generated. Even the metal trays and utensils represented industrial capacity devoted to items Japan had been melting down for weapons production since 1943. After dinner, the prisoners returned to their barracks. The lights stayed on until 2200 hours, allowing time for settling in. Each man had been issued bedding, toiletries, and basic clothing. The barracks had small stoves for heat, though the March evening was mild by Texas standards. As the prisoners prepared for sleep, the conversations continued in hushed tones. Matsuda lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling. He thought of the propaganda films shown to troops and civilians, depicting America as a decadent nation weakened by luxury and moral corruption, inevitably doomed to collapse under disciplined assault. Yet here, in a prison camp, in what was surely not the richest part of America, they received food that would be considered a feast back home. The dissonance was profound. Tanaka, the fisherman, had a different perspective. He had traveled to Alaska before the conflict began, working on fishing vessels. He had seen American ports, American warehouses stocked with goods. At the time, he had dismissed it as coastal wealth, not representative of the whole nation. But now, deep in the interior, that same abundance appeared. It was not a facade for foreign visitors. It was, apparently, normal. The next morning brought more revelations. Breakfast consisted of oatmeal with brown sugar, scrambled eggs, bacon, toast with jam, and orange juice. The portions were again generous. After the meal, prisoners were assigned to work details, required under camp regulations. The labor was not punishing. Some men maintained campgrounds, others worked in the laundry or kitchen. A few with carpentry skills helped with repairs and construction. The American supervisors treated the work as simply a job to be done. Private Torres, the guard with Japanese language ability, explained tasks clearly and answered questions without condescension. The prisoners received breaks every 2 hours with water always available. Lunch was brought to the work sites. Sandwiches made with fresh bread, meat, cheese, lettuce, and tomato, accompanied by fruit and cookies. This midday meal alone surpassed what many of the men had eaten for an entire day during the conflict. By the third day, Yamamoto began keeping a journal, writing in the margins of a notebook provided for prisoners to write letters home, though he had no intention of sending correspondence. He documented everything: the food quantities, the treatment by guards, the camp conditions, the medical care available. Dr. Chen had set up a sick call system where prisoners could receive treatment for any ailment, from serious injuries sustained during capture to minor complaints like headaches or stomach upset. The medical supplies available to her included medications that Japanese military hospitals had run short of years earlier. A week into their stay, the prisoners witnessed something that fundamentally challenged their understanding. A group of German prisoners, captured in North Africa 2 years earlier, had been at Lordsburg long enough to establish a small garden and were now expanding it. These men, enemies of America, were allowed tools, seeds, and space to grow vegetables. They sold or traded their produce to the camp administration, earning small amounts of scrip they could use at the camp store. The store itself was another revelation. Prisoners could purchase within limits items like tobacco, candy, toiletries, and magazines. The prices were subsidized, affordable even on the small wages prisoners earned for their work details. Yamamoto watched as a German prisoner bought cigarettes and a chocolate bar, conducting the transaction with casual normalcy that seemed to mock everything the Japanese servicemen had been taught about life under American control. Matsuda asked Torres about the German prisoner's experience. The private explained that the Europeans had been skeptical at first too, expecting harsh treatment. Instead, they found themselves in a system that, while certainly imprisonment, bore no resemblance to the brutal camps their own government operated. Many German prisoners had begun to question whether the information they had received about the conflict had been truthful. Some actively helped their American captors, providing intelligence about military dispositions and tactics. This information troubled the Japanese prisoners deeply. To cooperate with captors was the ultimate shame in their military culture. Yet the Germans seemed to feel no such compunction. They worked, ate, even laughed with American soldiers. The moral framework that had sustained the Japanese servicemen through capture and transportation was eroding with each passing day. 2 weeks after arrival, the camp administration arranged a film screening. Prisoners were invited, not required, to attend. The movie was a Hollywood production, a musical comedy from 1944. Most of the Japanese prisoners attended out of curiosity. What they saw on screen was perhaps more destabilizing than anything they had yet experienced. The film depicted an America of abundance almost beyond comprehension. Characters worried about trivial romantic problems while surrounded by luxury. Homes had multiple rooms, modern appliances, more furniture than entire Japanese households possessed. The casual waste visible in the background, food left on plates, new clothing treated as disposable. Cars used for short trips represented prosperity so far beyond Japanese experience that it seemed fantastical. Yet the prisoners now understood this was not fantasy. They were living in what was essentially the lowest tier of American society, a prison camp in a remote desert area, and they ate better than Japanese generals. If this represented the bottom, what did the top look like? The film's depiction, they now realized, might actually understate American wealth. Yamamoto discussed this with his fellow officers that night. Sato, who had been most skeptical of American motives, now faced an uncomfortable conclusion. If America possessed such overwhelming material superiority, what did that mean for the conflict's outcome? Japan's strategy had relied on assumptions of rough parity in resources, with Japanese discipline and fighting spirit offsetting any American advantages. But this was not rough parity. This was not even the same order of magnitude. The camp library, small but well-stocked, provided another window into American society. Matsuda, the former teacher, spent hours examining books and magazines. He found texts on American history, geography, and industry. The statistics were staggering. American steel production in 1944 exceeded 70 million tons. Japan's peak production, in 1943, had reached 7 million tons. American automobile factories converted to military production, manufactured tanks and aircraft at rates that Japanese industry could not approach even in peacetime. One figure particularly struck Matsuda. In 1944, American farms produced over 3 billion bushels of wheat. Japan's total grain production, including rice and all other cereals, for the entire war period never exceeded 100 million bushels annually. The United States fed not only its own population of 130 million, but also supplied significant food aid to its allied nations. Japan struggled to feed 70 million people on its home islands, even before considering military needs. Dr. Chen, during routine medical checks, spoke with prisoners about their health histories. She learned that many had suffered from beriberi, a disease caused by vitamin deficiency, even before capture. Malnutrition-related ailments were common. She treated these conditions with vitamin supplements and improved diet, watching men gain weight and recover strength. Her medical reports, which prisoners sometimes glimpsed, noted that the average Japanese prisoner arrived weighing 45 to 50 kilograms. After 1 month at Lordsburg, average weight increased to 55 to 60 kilograms. They were being restored to health by their captors. This fact contained within it a bitter irony that Tanaka articulated one evening. Their own government, they now understood, had likely sacrificed their well-being for military objectives that, given the resource disparities now obvious to them, were probably unattainable. The leadership had known the true extent of American capacity. They had access to intelligence, economic data, industrial surveys, yet they had launched and sustained a conflict against an opponent so materially superior that victory was mathematically impossible. 3 months into their internment, the prisoners at Lordsburg had settled into a routine that bore no resemblance to their expectations of captivity. They woke to bugle calls, ate substantial meals, performed reasonable labor, and had access to recreation including sports equipment and musical instruments. The camp had organized baseball teams, a sport many Japanese men knew well. American guards sometimes joined the games. Playing alongside prisoners in casual competition, that would have been unthinkable under the strict hierarchies of Japanese military culture. Colonel Mitchell instituted a policy of regular communication between camp administration and prisoner representatives. Yamamoto, recognized by both Americans and fellow prisoners as a natural leader, became one of these liaisons. In meetings with Captain Wright and other officers, he could raise concerns about camp conditions, suggest improvements, and relay information to the other prisoners. The Americans listened, often implementing reasonable requests. When prisoners asked for rice to supplement the American-style diet, the camp kitchen began serving rice with certain meals. When they requested materials for traditional crafts, the administration provided tools and supplies. This cooperative relationship deepened the psychological impact of imprisonment. The Americans were not cruel masters to be endured or resisted. They were administrators running a system that, while certainly restrictive, aimed for efficient, humane operation. This forced prisoners to confront uncomfortable truths about authority, government, and the nature of the conflict they had fought in. Matsuda, in conversations with Dr. Chen, learned about her own family's experience. Her parents had immigrated to America from China in 1920. They had faced discrimination, certainly, but had built a successful business through hard work and careful saving. When she decided to pursue medical education, universities in California had accepted her. She graduated in 1941, one of 3 women in her medical school class, and the only person of Asian descent. The American system had allowed this. Japanese universities did not admit women to medical programs. Japanese society did not offer similar opportunities to ethnic minorities. These contrasts accumulated in the prisoners' minds. Every aspect of life at Lordsburg revealed American capacity and challenged Japanese propaganda. The regular mail delivery showed an efficient postal system connecting the vast continent. The camp newspaper, produced by prisoners under American supervision, demonstrated freedom of expression impossible in Japan. The simple fact that prisoners could write to family, though letters were censored, proved more openness than Japanese civilians enjoyed in their own correspondence. By the summer of 1945, events beyond the camp walls began to penetrate the prisoners' awareness. News arrived of developments in the Pacific Theater, carefully presented by American information officers. The situation was clearly deteriorating for Japanese forces. Island after island had fallen. The naval strength that had seemed so formidable in 1942 had been systematically destroyed. American submarines, which numbered in the hundreds, had devastated Japanese merchant shipping. The home islands faced increasing isolation and privation. Yamamoto, with his military training, could read between the lines of official reports. The conflict was approaching its end, and that end would not favor Japan. Yet among the prisoners, the reaction was complex. Certainly they felt pain for their homeland and families, but they also felt a growing anger at the leadership that had led the nation into this disaster. The evidence before them every day showed that this outcome had been predictable, probably was predicted by those with access to accurate information, and yet the conflict had been pursued anyway. In August, news reached the camp that sent shockwaves through the prisoner population. 2 cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, had been destroyed by new weapons of unprecedented power. The American reports described devastation on a scale difficult to comprehend. Matsuda, whose family was in Hiroshima, sat in stunned silence for 3 days. Dr. Chen, showing compassion that transcended the circumstances, spoke with him privately, offering what comfort she could, while acknowledging the magnitude of the tragedy. Days later came the announcement that Japan had surrendered unconditionally. The conflict was over. For the prisoners at Lordsburg, this brought mixed emotions: relief that the bloodshed had ended, worry about families and communities at home, and a profound uncertainty about what came next. They were still prisoners, but prisoners of a war that no longer existed. Colonel Mitchell addressed the assembled prisoners through interpreters. He explained that they would remain in custody for the immediate future while repatriation was organized. This process would take months, possibly over a year. In the meantime, conditions at the camp would continue as they had been. This announcement, which might have provoked despair, instead brought a kind of resigned acceptance. The prisoners knew their treatment at Lordsburg was far better than what they would face returning to a defeated, occupied Japan. The months following surrender brought subtle changes. The camp relaxed certain restrictions. Prisoners could move more freely within the compound. Work assignments became more voluntary. Educational programs expanded, offering classes in English, American history, and various trades. The American authorities understood that these men would eventually return to Japan and hoped that their experience might influence the rebuilding of Japanese society along more democratic lines. Yamamoto enrolled in every class available. He studied English intensively, improving beyond basic communication to genuine fluency. He read American newspapers and magazines, developing understanding of democratic political systems, free markets, and civil liberties. The teacher in these classes, a civilian educator named Professor Edward Harrison from El Paso, approached his students with genuine respect, treating them as individuals capable of intellectual growth rather than as defeated enemies to be indoctrinated. Matsuda, after learning that his family had survived the Hiroshima attack, though their home was destroyed, threw himself into learning as well. He studied American teaching methods, educational philosophy, and child psychology. He envisioned returning to Japan to help rebuild the educational system along lines that emphasized critical thinking rather than rote obedience. The bitter lesson of Lordsburg, that his own education had been filled with lies and distortions, made him determined to offer Japanese children something better. Tanaka took carpentry classes, learning techniques and using tools superior to anything available in pre-war Japan. Sato, the career military man, struggled more than others with the new reality. His identity had been so thoroughly bound to military service and hierarchy that the collapse of those structures left him adrift. Yet even he eventually found purpose in the camp's nascent manufacturing cooperative, where prisoners produced furniture and crafts that were sold in El Paso, with proceeds split between the camp welfare fund and individual workers. Throughout 1946, prisoners gradually departed Lordsburg for repatriation. The process was bureaucratic and slow, prioritizing those with families in urgent need or those who had medical conditions requiring treatment unavailable at the camp. Yamamoto, Matsuda, and Tanaka remained until the final group departed in March of 1947, nearly 2 years after the conflict's end. Their final night at Lordsburg, the remaining 30 prisoners gathered for a farewell dinner hosted by Colonel Mitchell and the camp staff. The meal featured both American and Japanese dishes, a gesture of respect for the prisoners' culture. After dinner, Mitchell spoke briefly, through an interpreter, though many prisoners now understood English well enough to follow his words directly. He acknowledged the strange circumstances that had brought them together. He expressed hope that their experience, however unwanted initially, might contribute to building a peaceful future between their nations. He reminded them that they were not criminals, but servicemen who had fulfilled their duty as they understood it, and that their time at Lordsburg had demonstrated the possibility of dignity and humanity, even in the context of conflict and imprisonment. Yamamoto responded on behalf of the prisoners. His English was now good enough that he needed no interpreter. He thanked the colonel and staff for treatment that had exceeded not just expectations, but anything they had imagined possible. He spoke honestly about the psychological difficulty of recognizing that they had been deceived by their own leadership, that the conflict had been based on false premises, and that the enemy they had been taught to hate had shown them more consideration than their own government had. He expressed hope that Japan, in defeat, might learn from America about building a society that valued individual dignity and material prosperity over military glory and sacrifice. The next morning, the prisoners boarded trains that would take them to San Francisco for the voyage back to Japan. As the locomotive pulled away from Lordsburg, Matsuda watched the camp recede into the distance. The place had been a prison, yet it had also been where his worldview had shattered and reformed. He carried with him memories of abundance, of systematic fairness, of Americans who treated defeated enemies with a basic human decency that propaganda had insisted was impossible. The voyage across the Pacific took 2 weeks. The ship was a converted transport, not luxurious but adequate. The food, even now, exceeded what they expected to find in occupied Japan. As they approached Yokohama, the prisoners could see the devastation. The great port city lay in ruins, destroyed by bombing. The industrial capacity that had never been sufficient to match American production was now reduced to rubble and twisted metal. Repatriation processing took days. Japanese officials, working under American occupation authority, documented each returning prisoner. The society they re-entered was transformed almost beyond recognition. Food shortages were severe. The black market dominated economic life. Yet, amid the chaos, American occupation forces were implementing reforms: land redistribution, educational modernization, women's suffrage, labor rights, dissolution of monopolistic conglomerates. The principles Yamamoto had studied at Lordsburg were being imposed on Japan by the nation that had defeated it. Yamamoto returned to his family's home in Osaka, finding his parents and siblings malnourished but alive. He shared the American rations he had been allowed to carry with him, then began seeking work in the new Japan taking shape around him. His fluent English and understanding of American systems made him valuable to the occupation administration. He eventually became a liaison officer, helping to implement economic reforms, using knowledge gained as a prisoner to help rebuild his nation. Matsuda made his way to Hiroshima, finding his family living in a makeshift shelter near the ruins of their former neighborhood. The city was a landscape of devastation, but reconstruction was beginning. He rejoined the education system, bringing with him ideas about democratic education, critical thinking, and the importance of teaching students to question authority rather than blindly obey it. His students, growing up in the shadow of atomic destruction, needed to understand how unquestioning loyalty had led to catastrophe. Tanaka returned to Hokkaido, to his fishing village on the northern coast. The boats were damaged, the fleet depleted, but the sea still provided. He used his carpentry skills, learned at Lordsburg, to help rebuild the village. More importantly, he shared with anyone who would listen the story of how America's enemies were treated, contrasting it sharply with how the Japanese military had treated prisoners and even its own soldiers. His words, multiplied across thousands of returning prisoners, contributed to a fundamental shift in Japanese society's understanding of the conflict and its causes. Years later, in the 1960s, when Japan had rebuilt into an economic power, Yamamoto received an invitation to speak at a symposium on post-war reconciliation. He was asked what moment had most affected him during his imprisonment. He thought back through 2 years at Lordsburg, through countless meals and conversations, through the gradual erosion of propaganda and the painful growth of understanding. He told the audience about the first night, about receiving that tray of roasted chicken and vegetables and bread, about the moment he understood that America's strength was not just military, but economic, not just material, but also moral. He described how a simple dinner had contained within it the seeds of truth that would eventually grow into recognition that the conflict had been unwinnable from the start, that their leaders had known this, and that they had been sacrificed to a cause built on lies. That meal, more than any battle or interrogation or propaganda film, had made them question the conflict, because it revealed not American cruelty, which they had been prepared to endure, but American abundance and systematic fairness, which their worldview could not accommodate. And in struggling to reconcile that cognitive dissonance, they had begun the journey from indoctrinated soldiers to individuals capable of critical thought. The prisoners who passed through Lordsburg and similar camps numbered in the thousands. Their experience, shared with families and communities after repatriation, contributed to Japan's post-war transformation. They had seen that prosperity came not from conquest but from productivity, that strength arose not from enforced uniformity but from protected diversity, and that a society that valued individual dignity over collective sacrifice could achieve outcomes that military discipline could not. The story of what Japanese prisoners of conflict were given on their first night in Texas is, ultimately, a story about the power of truth over propaganda, of material reality over ideology, and of how sometimes the most devastating weapon is not violence, but generosity, not cruelty but systematic fairness. Those men had expected punishment and received instead a demonstration of the very principles their enemy claimed to value, that all people, even defeated enemies, possessed inherent dignity deserving of respect. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.